on today. Now, I'll begin with a narration from Sahih Bukhari that talks about how at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Usayd ibn Hudayr radiallahu anhu, who was a senior companion of the Prophet ﷺ, he comes to the Prophet and he tells him about an experience that he had the night before. He says, I was standing in the outer part of my property and I was offering my prayer at night. And as I continued to recite the Quran, my horse started to react. It started to buck. It became frantic. And so it made me pause, but I continued reciting. But then the horse started to freak out again. And so I recited again, and then the horse stopped. Or I stopped reciting and the horse stopped. And then I started to recite again, and the horse again became frantic. فانصرف وكان ابنه يحيى قريبا منها فأشفق أن تصيبه. But his son Yahya was sleeping out in the courtyard, and so Usayd ibn Hudayr was afraid that the horse would trample his son. So he went to his son and he said, فإذا مثل ظل. And he says to the Prophet ﷺ that he saw this deep, dark, dense cloud that was hanging over their heads. فيها أمثال المصابيح. There was these in this deep, dark, dense cloud, there was lamps, glimmering lights in that dark cloud that was hovering over them. And so then the cloud starts to move away. And he says, afterwards, I stopped reciting. And it kept moving away until it was so far above I could no longer see it. So I went to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and I told him the whole story. And when I told the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that I was reciting and the horse started reciting and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the horse started reacting, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Iqra ya Ibn Hudayr, Iqra ya Ibn Hudayr. You should have kept reciting, ya Ibn Hudayr. You should have kept reciting." And he says, I did, ya Rasulullah. I kept reciting, but the more I recited, the more my horse was reacting, and I got scared that the horse was going to hurt my son. So I decided to calm my recitation. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Tilka al-malaika," that deep dark cloud that you saw that has glimmering beautiful lights inside the cloud, that was an army of angels that came down. Now why? Why did these army of angels came down? Dantali saltik, because they wanted to hear you recite the Quran. They wanted to listen to you recite the Quran. وَلَوْ قَرَأْتَ لَأَصْبَحْتَ يَنْظُرُ النَّاسُ إِلَيْهَا لَا تَتَوَارَى مِنْهَا. I understand the circumstances made you worry for your son. But had you kept reciting, that cloud would have become so large and so dense that all the people of Mecca would have witnessed it and Medina would have witnessed it, and it would not have disappeared. Now, the reason why I begin with this particular narration, because I want us to create a mindset, to impress upon all of us the power and the beauty and the significance of the Quran, and how it is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the speech of Allah. It is the book of Allah. It is Allah's words Himself. And the greatest honor that has been bestowed upon the human being, that truly distinguishes the human being from all other of Allah's creation, the more we reflect on the animal kingdom, we watch our Planet Earth on Netflix or whatever it may be, right? We see that there are creatures that are physically stronger than us, that are bigger than us, that are faster than us, right? Some creatures might even be smarter than us. It's okay. But one thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored us over all other creation is what? Is the honor of being able to recite the Quran. Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran khalaqa al-insan allamahu al-bayan. That's what makes human beings remarkable. Right? That we've been taught the Quran and we've been taught clear speech and clarity. And so the human being has been given the gift of the words of Allah, the Quran. We can read it with our mouths. We can utter the words of Allah. So how astounding is it? What an honor that we have, right? So, how many of you guys heard the verses of Ramadan and fasting in Surah Al-Baqarah. You guys have heard it before, right? Right. So I want to do something kind of unique today. I want you to pretend that you are in the shoes of a companion today and that you have never heard these verses before. And what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that these verses are being revealed to the companions for the first time. And this is really important because it puts into perspective what the verses are about and the purpose. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, kutiba alaykum as-siyam, kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, la'allakum tattaqun. O believers, fasting is prescribed upon you as it was prescribed for those before you, so perhaps that you will be mindful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now pause, and remember, pretend that you're a companion hearing these verses for the first time. Right now, what you've just heard is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed upon you fasting, correct? We still don't know when, we still don't know how many days, we still don't know whether I should fast when I'm traveling and when I'm sick, we don't know how long during the day, we still don't have any of that information. Not yet. And then the next verse comes and says, أَيَّامًا مَعْدُودَاتٍ فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخْرَى. Right? Fast a prescribed number of days. Okay, so now I know it's a few number of days, it's not forever. It's a number of days. And then this verse has some fiqh, descriptions about what to do when you're sick or what to do when you're traveling, making them up later. If you're not able to make them up later, then you feed a hungry person, etc. Now the next verse is the important one that I want to focus on, right? So remember, up until this point, what's happened? You have been prescribed fasting, number one. And the second that has happened now, you know that you're supposed to fast for a fixed number of days. Do you still know when you're supposed to fast? What month? You don't know. You still don't know. Then the next verse comes. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. The month of Ramadan in which the Quran was revealed. هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان. It is revealed as a guide for humanity with clear proof of guidance and decisive authority. فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ. There we go. And whoever is present during this month, that is when you fast. Let them fast. So, we were prescribed fasting. We were told a little bit of how to fast and how many days in a little bit. Then we were told the month of Ramadan. But before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connects the month of Ramadan to fasting, what does He connect it to? شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. The Quran. So the maqsad, the purpose of the month of Ramadan is the Quran. It's the Quran. Now the obligations of us is to fast, correct? Ittifaqan, nobody disagrees with this, right? You disagree with this, you probably shouldn't be here. So this is ittifaqan. The obligation of fasting stands. But if we're not connecting with the Quran in the month of Ramadan and building a stronger relationship with the Quran in the month of Ramadan, we're missing out on the maqsad of the month, the purpose of the month, which is the Quran, right? So we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with this Quran. There's so much blessings that go on with it. So much so that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in many instances, he refers to people as Sahib al-Quran. That a person can grow so much in the relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that this person is a companion of the Quran. So this is the greatest blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about that blessing in numerous verses. For example, Surah Al-Baqarah as well, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَتْلُونَهُ حَقَّ تِلَاوَتِهِ. That the believers are those who have been given the book and they recite it the way it should be recited. Whether that is, the haqq that it deserves, the tajweed that it deserves, the makharaj it deserves, the understanding, the tadabbur that it deserves. There's a lot of, that can be given here based on the rights that the Quran has over us. أُولَٰئِكَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ. It is they who truly believe in it. They understand it. They spend time with it. They memorize it. وَمَن يَكْفُرْ بِهِ, and as for those who reject it, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْخَاسِرُونَ, they are the ones who are going to be considered losers. So this Qur'an that has been bestowed upon us, right? The sunnah of Allah is that whenever a blessing is given to the creation, the blessing is not just a blessing that the creation can just use however they want. It also becomes a responsibility and an opportunity. So the Qur'an is the greatest blessing that has been bestowed upon mankind, which means it is the greatest opportunity and responsibility that mankind has. So what are some opportunities and responsibilities that come with this gift, and what we should be doing during the month of Ramadan in order to uphold those responsibilities and opportunities? I'll talk about 3, when in reality there's probably hundreds, but I'll just talk about 3 today. The first and foremost, the first opportunity we have is to recite the Qur'an, right? To recite the Qur'an as much as we can, having a regular relationship with the Qur'an. And so in order to emphasize this, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentions and motivates us and inspires us through many narrations. And one narration where the Prophet says, "Man qara'a harfan min kitabillah, falahu bihi hasana, wal hasanatu bi'ashri amthaliha." That for every person that recites a harf from the Qur'an, a letter from the Qur'an, they will have 1 reward. And each reward is multiplied how many? 10 times. Each reward is multiplied 10 times. لا أقول ألف لام ميم حرف. I don't say that ألف لام ميم is 1 harf. ولكن ألف حرف ولام حرف وميم حرف. I say that the alif is 1 harf, the lam is 1 harf, the mim is 1 harf. So when I recite Surah Al-Baqarah in salah or at home, and I say alif lam mim, that's 30 reward right there. 30 good deeds I just got just by saying those 3 letters. So much barakah, so much blessings and reward that can be gained from reciting and interacting with the Qur'an. Now there are 2 realities of human nature. One is whenever we become proficient or comfortable in something, then we tend to take it for granted. We take that skill, that ability for granted. And the other thing of human reality is that when something is very challenging, when it's difficult, then we start to lose motivation to do it because it's not a fun feeling initially. It feels like you're running up against a wall. So we give up, we turn around and we walk away. We sometimes start to make excuses for ourselves. But the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he addresses both of these realities of human nature. That he says the example of the one who recites the Qur'an and memorizes it is the one who he is with the al-kiram al-barara. The noble scribes, the righteous noble scribes, the angels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the example of the one who recites the Qur'an and is committed to it, although it's difficult for him, then falahu ajran. There is a double reward for them in it. There's double reward. So Prophet ﷺ motivates the one who has the proficiency in the Qur'an and the one who is learning the Qur'an for the first time, telling us that the more time you invest, the more you persist in the Qur'an, the more you will be rewarded. And Allah will reward all of our unwillingness to quit in terms of being able to recite, being able to perfect our tajweed, being able to understand the tafsir of the Qur'an, understand the Arabic language. Whatever obstacle we are trying to overcome in order to become closer to the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards that unwillingness to quit. And so that's the first opportunity and responsibility that we have, which is to recite the Qur'an, having a daily regimen with the Qur'an. And we're in the month of Sha'ban, which means that it is the perfect month for us to build the habits that we want to have in the month of Ramadan. If we wait for the month of Ramadan to build the habits that we want to have in Ramadan, we're gonna basically be missing out on 10 days, because the first 10 days you're trying to build the habits. But if you already have the habits built before, then once Ramadan comes, I'm ready, right? It's why you go to practice before you go to a game. Sha'ban is our practice, it's our training. We're running plays in practice. We're drawing up plays on the whiteboard. We're watching film. We're doing everything that we need to do to prepare for our opponents. Right? Our opponent in this circumstance is shaitan. We want to make sure that in the month of Ramadan, when shaitan is locked up, that we're maximizing our month of Ramadan. Right? We're maximizing completely our month of Ramadan. So we want to have those habits built now. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promises something. He promises us what? وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We have certainly made the Quran easy to remember. So is there anyone who will be mindful? And so this is a promise to anyone who wants to learn, anyone who will learn, anyone who is learning right now. And guess what? If anybody wants to tease you, make fun of you for learning the Quran, maybe you're older, maybe you didn't have a chance, maybe you converted recently, maybe you didn't take it seriously when you were a kid and now you want to take it seriously now, whatever the reason might be. Right? Then remind those who try to mock that the Quran was not revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ until he was 40 years old. And it was preserved in his heart over the course of 23 years. But it's important we don't create that obstacle in our head that it's too late. It's not too late. I visited a community recently, subhanAllah. I met this old man, 72 years old. And he converted to Islam. I was talking to him and I was hearing his story. He converted to Islam when he was 54. Okay, 54 years old. As soon as he converted to Islam, he starts learning how to read the Quran almost immediately. A year later, he's pretty fluent in how to read the Quran. He spent a lot of time, a lot of practice. So then he started memorizing the Quran. Right? At 55, he started memorizing the Quran. He finished it at 67. He finished memorizing the Quran 12 years later at 67. He started when? 55. He finished at 67, and he's 72 years old right now. He leads Salah. He leads Taraweeh the past 2 years. Because in his community, he's seen as one of the people that knows the most Quran. But the thing is, he didn't create that obstacle for himself. He never told himself that it's too late, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises us in the Quran that those who are sincere, those who want to make that effort, it will be easy for you, don't worry. Right? And that's the promise of Allah. That doesn't happen with any other language, any other book, any other skill. It doesn't work. That a child, a month later after starting to read the Quran, they're memorizing. Or someone accepts Islam and a month later they're reciting chapters from memory. Or how in Gaza right now, we're seeing even in the midst of a genocide, there's still graduating Huffaz amongst them. I'm seeing clips daily of teenagers and young kids who are completing their tahfidh of the Quran in the middle of a genocide. So what excuse do we have? Allah will make it easy. We just have to have that, we just have to try. And so that's what the next opportunity is to memorize the Quran. After reciting, we want to memorize it. And so again, it seems daunting because we start to think of ourselves and we think about the person who is the hafiz, the person who's reciting in Taraweeh for an hour straight from memory. And we look at Everest, but we don't realize that there's a hill in front of us. And in order to get to the peak of Everest, we have to climb a bunch of mini hills first. But we should memorize something, preserve it in our hearts. Whether it's Fatiha, Ikhlas, Nas, Falaq, right? MashaAllah, Dr. Yahya, I was talking to him before I came here, and he told me that you guys are very ambitious people, right? This community is a very ambitious community. So, a challenge for you guys, inshallah, right? Unless you've already memorized the Quran, then alhamdulillah, takbir, Allahu Akbar, right? But if you haven't memorized the Quran, one thing that I challenge for anybody that's listening and anybody that wants to benefit is find a tafsir series, right? Find I don't know, a Surah Yasin tafsir series, Surah Mulk tafsir series. And your job in the month of Ramadan is to memorize the Quran, right, in line with that series. So you watch episode 1 and they do verse 1 through 6, for example. You memorize verses 1 through 6, right? And then you just try to memorize an entire surah in the month of Ramadan, right? But it's necessary for the Quran to live in the heart of a believer. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith in Tirmidhi that describes the heart of a Muslim that does not contain any Quran, and he calls it Kalbayt al-Kharib. It's like an old, abandoned, dark home. Because the reality is the Quran is the nur. The speech of Allah is the nur. Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu yukhrijuhum min adh-dhulumat إلى النور. That Allah is the guardian of the believers. He brings them out of darkness and into the light. So start listening to the Quran when we're driving, when we're working, when we're walking. And again, if anyone is intimidated by that, remember what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said again, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. It is a lot easier than we realize. We just want to make that effort. We just want to make that effort. And effort, my brothers and sisters, is all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks from us. That's all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks from us. I've had this standing challenge for a few years now, that if anybody can give me evidence from the Quran or the Sunnah that Allah and His Messenger want results as a means of our salvation and not our efforts, I will change my mind on this. It doesn't exist. Right? It does not exist. Results is not the reason for our salvation, it is the effort. So much so that the scholars say that if you make the sincere intention to memorize the Quran and you try a verse a day, a word a day, a harf a day, a letter a day, right? But you're trying bit by bit to get through the entire Quran, you're making that sincere effort, then on the day of judgment you will be resurrected amongst the Hufad on day of judgment. Why? Because إِنَّمَا الْعَمَلُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. You are rewarded based on your intention. You are rewarded based on your efforts. So you will get that full reward. You'll get it. So effort is all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks from us. Now the opposite is actually true. There's an example the Prophet ﷺ gives us that people who achieved the result, but they did not have the effort. They did not have the sincerity. Maybe they had the effort, but they did not have the sincerity. Right? The first 3 people to enter the hellfire. Right? Who are they? Can anybody name them for me? Yes. Yes, person who memorized the Quran, the scholar. What's the second one? Sorry? That's included with the Hafiz of the Quran. The Shaheed, correct. And the third? The one that gives a lot of charity. Correct, right? But why? Right? This is good stuff. This is the result, right? This is what we want to see. It's because, as you mentioned, they all did it for the wrong reasons. Right? They all did it for the wrong reasons. The Hafiz of the Quran, the scholar, wanted people to be like, oh, mashallah, look at him. Right? He knows what he's talking about. He can give a lecture for 20 minutes at Mayf and act like he's all that. And the Shaheed wanted to be seen as brave in the battlefield, but didn't really do it for the sake of Allah, just wanted people to praise him and honor him. And the one that gave a lot of charity wanted people to say, oh, look at him, mashallah, philanthropist. Allahu Akbar, a very generous guy, mashallah, tabarakallah. But none of them did it for the sake of Allah. So those will be the first 3 people that enter the hellfire. So we actually have evidence of the opposite, that people can achieve the results, but not get the reward. Not get the reward. You guys might have seen the viral video that's been going around the past couple days of the Egyptian man. Right? There's an Egyptian man in a farmer's market, and there's these aid trucks that are passing through the farmer's market to get to the Rafah gate, right? To try to get aid into Gaza. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for them. And they're trying to get aid into Gaza. And so this Egyptian man, right? Because the Egyptian people are not like their leadership and not like their government, and so is the vast majority of the Arab world. They're not like their leaders or their governments, but the people have a good heart and good effort and good sincerity. All he has with him is a fruit stand, and in the fruit stand is just a bunch of oranges. He starts grabbing the oranges and he starts throwing them into the trucks. Because that's all he can do. That's the effort that he had. That's the sincerity that he had. Right? Now the reality is, the likelihood of those oranges actually reaching the border, probably not very likely. Because those trucks get stuck in the border for days. By the time, the oranges will probably be spoiled. Not even edible. But that's not the point though. The point is that the oranges landed in Allah's hands before they ever landed in that truck as soon as He threw them. That you just trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm doing whatever I can. Some tafsir mentioned that in the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he was in the fire, there were small animals like birds and frogs that would come with little bits of water in their mouth and try to extinguish the fire. And obviously the fire is massive. It's like the size of a town. And so that little bit of water, it's not going to do anything. But at least that frog and that bird on the day of judgment can go and tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I tried to help your wali. I tried to help your friend with whatever that I can. Right? And so sometimes we all get caught up and we think of ourselves, and it's unfortunate that as Muslims we have this mentality, because the reality is the results have never been in our hands. Never. They've never been in our hands. They've always been in the hands of Allah. And so we sometimes have the mentality of what? No, unless I see a clear purpose of why we're doing what we're doing, then I'm not going to do it. Right? I'm not going to donate, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do whatever, because it's not going to work. I don't see how this is going to work, so I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to sit back and wait until I see something that's actually going to work. Habibi, that's not how it works. When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ went to the battle of Khandaq, 800 Muslims. And how many were the opposition? 10,000. And so the Prophet ﷺ receives word that 10,000 Christian tribes, Jewish tribes, tribes from the Quraysh have gathered together in order to attack Medina. So now he has to defend his city. And so he goes to the outskirts of his city and he has no plan. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the one who receives wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, had no plan. I don't know what to do. And he just went. He just said, we're just going to have to, the results are in Allah's hands. We're just going to have to go make the effort. And that's when he started seeking counsel with his companions. And Salman al-Farisi told him about digging a trench. And during the battle, there was one companion who crossed over from the other side, Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud, from Bani Ghatfan, who was very intelligent, and he played the political game, and he was able to deceive the enemy and was able to get them to collapse within themselves, within each other, and then averted the enemy away. But when the Prophet ﷺ went originally, he didn't know what was going to happen. He just knew that I have to trust Allah. The results are in Allah's hands, and we just have to make that effort of defending our city and defending our people. Right? Anyways, Rasulullah ﷺ says that it will be said to the Sahib al-Quran to start reading and reciting like you did in the world and start ascending the levels of paradise, and you will land where you stopped reciting. Right? And so again, on the Day of Judgment, what are we going to do? We're going to marvel at the Hafiz. But inshallah, we all made that intention that I mentioned earlier, so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala resurrect us with all the Hufaz, inshallah, even if we're not ones ourselves. And they have memorized, 6,000 plus verses? And I can only do 20, 30, 50? But climbing 50 levels of paradise is not such a bad idea when you think about it. Every verse is going to be a level of paradise. And so you just keep climbing, you keep climbing. In this world, you're just going to keep climbing and climbing and climbing, inshallah. And so that's the optimal time with the month of Ramadan around the corner to start reciting, start listening as much as we can, inshallah ta'ala. Now the third opportunity and responsibility is to make an effort to understand it. Right? This is important, this is very critical. And I understand we might have a great affinity for the Quran and love for the Quran in terms of its recitation, it adorns our walls, but the Quran was sent to us to reflect upon it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ. So the Prophet Muhammad didn't just send down the Quran, or the Prophet didn't just deliver the Quran to us, and it was sent down to the Prophet Muhammad by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you also need to explain it to the people. You need to have the people understand it. Which is why there is no understanding the Quran without studying the life of the one it was sent to. The seerah and the hadith literature are necessary in our effort to understanding the Quran. And how many times does the Quran say, أَفَلَا تَتَدَبِّرُونَ بِالْقُرْآنِ? Right? Do you not reflect on the Quran? You know, one day there was a young Ansari companion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ who was very smart, very good student to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. His name is Ziyad ibn Labid. One day, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was lecturing, and he said, right? He said many things. And so Ziyad ibn Labid, he narrates this, and he said he was lecturing to us, and he said many things. And he said something that really just shocked me. It shook me. And he said, the knowledge will leave the people. So Ziyad says, Ya Rasulullah, how are we going to lose the knowledge of this deen? We read the Quran, we teach it to our children, they will also teach it to theirs, and so on and so forth. So the Prophet Muhammad said, I'm disappointed in you, Ya Zayd, or Ya Ziyad. You're supposed to be a smart young man. I thought you were one of the smartest people in Medina. What's going on, my guy? But you did not understand this. Look at the nations that came before us. What do? They continue to engage in the rituals of their religion. But they lost complete understanding of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was actually saying to them. So, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is telling us that those are two very good steps when reading the Quran. Reciting and memorizing, but also the third step is crucial, the understanding aspect of it. Understanding the Quran. Now again, that invokes images of scholars and images of, people that have all these great accolades. People like Sheikh Yahya, Sheikh Abdullahi, who stand here and sit here and they do hours and hours of tafsir lessons, and they're cracking open the tafsir books, and they're breaking it down academically, they're breaking down every root word, and all this, right? But again, we can't intimidate ourselves. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. There are practical steps that can be taken, tried and tested, where anyone and everyone can start reflecting on the Quran. Reflecting on the Quran is an obligation on everybody. It's not an obligation only on the scholars. Taking one verse a day and reflecting over it is a good thing to do for every individual. How does that verse impact you? How does that verse reflect on your life? How does that verse apply to your day-to-day? You reflect on that and you think about it as you're going through the day. You pick one verse a day and do that, right? During the month of Ramadan, that's what we could do. One thing that we can do. Now, when it comes to the authoritative meaning of the Quran, where somebody stands on the minbar or stands in the lecture and says that, they're giving a tafsir lesson and they're saying what the verse actually means, that's left to the scholars, right? That's when we open the tafsir books and give the authoritative meaning. I can't use my reflection as authoritative to the rest of the ummah, right? But the act of reflecting itself is a beautiful thing that every believer should do, right? Listening to tafsir gatherings, if there's a gathering of tafsir that you know in your area, you go to that, right? Even just reading a translation of the Quran to help you understand if you don't understand the Arabic language, starting to understand the Arabic language to help you better understand the Quran, right? So many small steps that we can take in order to help us memorize the Quran. But the purpose is what? To take it step by step, one at a time. Because in order for Ibn Kathir to become Ibn Kathir, for Razi to become Razi, for Ibn Ashur to become Ibn Ashur, it took them a long time. It took them a lot of effort. They also had to start somewhere. They had to start with learning Alif Ba Ta as well, just like everybody else. But then they kept working on it and kept working on it, and they reached the levels that they were at. And now we consider to them to be some of the authoritative figures of the tafsir of the Quran. Now, the last opportunity and responsibility is to start living by the Quran, right? So during the month of Ramadan, we don't want to just read the Quran and understand the Quran and then not live in accordance with the Quran. But when we understand the Quran, so that third step actually leads to that fourth step. When you understand the Quran and how it talks about having good character, how it talks about treating your parents righteously, how it talks about giving charity, how it talks about having good conduct and being patient and having gratitude and having integrity and courage and kindness and forgiveness and bravery and decency and honesty and conviction, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about all of these things. So that third step leads to that last step. That in order to understand, in order to live according to the guidance, we have to understand the guidance. And so Aisha radiallahu anha, one day she was asked, about the character of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she responded and she said, "Alasta taqra'u al-Quran?" Haven't you read the Quran? Because فَإِنَّ خُلُقَ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم كان القرآن. The character of the Prophet Muhammad sallam was the Quran. So, one thing that we can do is read the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallam and see his character shine through in all the stories that we read, and that's the character of the Quran. He is the walking, talking Quran, is the Prophet Muhammad, because every word that the Prophet Muhammad himself said is an indirect wahy. وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. There is not a single thing the Prophet Muhammad said that is out of his own desire. It is all inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we actually say there's two forms of revelation, there's two forms of wahy, right? Which is the Quran and the hadith, the kalam of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, because he did not err in his speech. Now I will end and conclude by providing the motivation and inspiration that the Prophet Muhammad sallam gives us to start taking the steps to build a relationship with the Quran. The Prophet Muhammad sallam says in an authentic hadith in Sahih Muslim that اقرأوا القرآن فإنه يأتي يوم القيامة شفيعا لأصحابه. So recite the Quran, for on the day of judgment it will come as an intercessor for its reciters. And so with that, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make the Quran a light in our hearts. اللهم اجعل القرآن العظيم ربيع قلوبنا ونور صدورنا وذهاب همومنا وغمومنا. اللهم ذكرنا منه ما نسينا وعلمنا منه ما جهلنا وارزقنا تلاوته آناء الليل وأطراف النهار على وجه الذي يرضيك عنا. اللهم اجعله حجة لنا ولا تجعله حجة علينا وسائق لنا إلى جناتك وجنات برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اجعلنا ممن يقرأه فيرقى ولا تجعلنا ممن يقرأه فيزل ويشقى. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions, Jamaah? No questions? Yes. If you don't know the meaning but you recite the verses, do you still get a reward? Absolutely, yes. Yes, absolutely, you do. Right? But the more you understand the meaning and the more you reflect on it, the deeper the reward can be, because then you start thinking about how to apply the verses in your daily life. Right? But just the act of reciting alone, even without any understanding, is, you're getting all the reward. As we mentioned at the beginning, 10 reward for every letter, alhamdulillah. And if you're struggling with it, that's even double, alhamdulillah. Right? Okay, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.